I'm going to be talking about some of the 18th century accounts of Newton that were essentially rediscovered in the 19th century and published then for the first time. This was a period where people were getting very interested in manuscript sources, in critical reading of sources, and in trying to look at lives more critically through the use of such sources. It's a period, of course, where we find even the Bible and the life of Jesus being examined in this kind of way. So it's not surprising that Newton's life too sort of went through this kind of critical analysis. Although he was a very important hero of science and as I was saying in the previous section, through the 18th century, he'd really developed into this sort of archetypical hero of British science, of the sort of rational mechanical philosophy, and very much a hero of Anglican science as well. But the 19th century interest in manuscripts wasn't always sort of as critical as that. Quite a lot of the interest in what Newton left behind just sort of came out in a kind of antiquarian spirit. People who just wanted to find this information, see things that had been sort of touched by a great hand and so on, gave it its own sort of frisson, and just sort of happy to get this information out there. And the very first publication that's important in the 19th century in these terms was essentially a work of local history that was published by Edmund Turner in 1806. It was a work on the history of Grantham and the surrounding area, and Turner himself and his family owned Woolsthorpe Manor, which was Newton's family home. And it was because of his personal antiquarian interest, his interest in the locality, and his developing personal interest in Newton that led him to look at Newton's archive and then to select and publish various things from it. Once again, the thing that he found most interesting were the collected memoirs and anecdotes that John Conduit had put together, both in order to inform Fontenelle for his biography of Newton, and also the things that he collected after that when he'd planned to produce his own biography, which he never did, but which he hoped would counter sort of Fontenelle's Frenchified version as he saw it. So Turner reproduces the whole of the memoir that Conduit sent to Fontenelle, and also selected bits of other correspondence and anecdotes produced by Fontenelle, William Stukely and others. And from this we get the full source for many of the quotes and sort of descriptions of Newton's personality that were already fairly well known. But in addition, you get a much fuller account of Newton's childhood, his life at Cambridge and so on. All of these things very much to the taste of people who were interested in finding out about people's lives, childhood development, what the nature of genius and scientific genius was all about. There was certain other sort of documents that produced quotes that again became great favourites among biographers, including a quote that Conduit put down attributing to Newton about how he saw himself not as a sort of great genius, but merely as a boy playing on the seashore, picking up the odd pebble or shell, while the whole ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. And again, this very much suited tastes. It sort of showed the modest Christian philosopher sort of you know, seeing himself as only one small part of God's creation and so on. So that's something that, again, gets taken up very quickly by other biographers and becomes very much part of the standard, quite idealised image of Newton and his personality. But the 19th century is perhaps sort of even more important for a series of much more problematic revelations that came out of the archives that writers had to deal with in one way or another. For those who felt it was very important to prop up Newton's reputation and particularly to see Newton as this great hero of British and Anglican science, they had to try and counter this. But for others who were much more interested in sort of destroying some of these myths and in breaking this kind of bond between science and Christianity and so on, it was fuel for them as well. So they were quite interested in getting this kind of material out. It was quite a sort of critical period in understanding Newton and his life. So we have, first of all, the revelation that Newton suffered a breakdown in the 1690s. This is something that comes out of correspondence that's rediscovered and published in the 1820s. This is particularly important, perhaps, and particularly shocking because it is a complete turnaround of the story of Newton and his dog Diamond and Newton's sort of great calmness in face of adversity. People connect the apparent fact of Newton's sort of disarrangement of mind with the possibility of there having been a fire that destroyed his papers. But rather than being quite calm about it, we suddenly see that he's actually put into great difficulties and his mind is seriously disturbed, at least for a period. And this is something that was really quite shocking when it came out at the time. And again, people who wished to defend Newton's reputation were very quick to try and reinterpret this or show that Newton was actually producing other kind of important or quite sane works at the same period. Some of the other revelations that come out from looking at Newton's own archive include things, of course, like seeing the extent of his unorthodox religious beliefs, which again is a problem for those who see Newton as the hero of Anglican science. Likewise, the extent of his interest in alchemy comes out, which sort of undermines the idea of Newton as the great rational hero as people see it at the time. And something else that comes out as well is Newton's real in-depth involvement in some of the controversies that he had with his contemporaries. Most obviously, of course, that with Leibniz over the invention of the calculus. And it becomes clear that Newton really orchestrates the whole anti-Leibniz campaign. And again, this goes very much against the received idea of what Newton's personality was all about, that Conduit had put forward, Fontenelle had put forward, all those other 18th century biographers had repeated about his shying away from controversy, his dislike of publishing and being sort of active in that kind of controversy. One of the most important 18th century accounts of Newton's personality, however, that gets rediscovered in the 19th century is that was produced by John Flamsteed, the Astronomer Royal. It's well known now that Flamsteed and Newton had a very serious falling out, particularly when Flamsteed discovered that Newton, Halley and other members of the Royal Society had decided to print his catalogue of stars without informing him, basically pirating his work as he saw it. And as a result of this and various other things, he felt entirely persecuted by these people, and he interprets Newton perhaps through that lens, but also perhaps just through his dealings with the individual man throughout his life. And so both in correspondence and in a number of sort of autobiographical fragments, and also in a preface to his work that was never actually published, Flamsteed gives this image of Newton that goes again very much against the sort of normal standard pattern that previous biographers had set out. So he presents Newton as someone who has a terrible temper, someone who's very susceptible to the flattery of people like Halley and others, someone who's always jealous and ambitious, insidious. All of these words come out of Flamsteed's writings, published in 1835 for the first time by Francis Bailey. And likewise we have Flamsteed describing Newton's sort of fits of temper, some of the bad language that he used, and in general his persecution of someone who was not in as powerful position as Newton himself was. I think what's interesting in the 19th century and in 19th century biographies and in commentary, we almost have sort of two coexisting views of Newton. The standard idea, the standard words that we connect with them, the standard anecdotes that have repeated from biography to biography, these absolutely remain at the same time as some of the more sort of complicated and difficult aspects of Newton's personality and life come out. And this even, I think, remains today. So we have still people learn the sort of anecdotes about Newton, and even some of those more pleasant quotes, particularly sort of Newton's quotes about his modesty and the sort of, trying to say that it was only sort of hard work and patient thought that led to his achievements rather than any great personal genius. These are the kinds of things that people often first know about Newton, rather than any of these more complicated pictures. Although in in-depth biographies now we do rather like the sort of dark side as well, I think that those anecdotes and the sort of more idealised version of Newton is still something that's very important. It says something essentially more important about us, about our understanding of science, than perhaps the real historical Newton does.